David, Margot. Hey, congratulations on your new documentary, Beatles 64 on Disney Plus.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gig. Nice to talk to you.
Now, it's a pleasure to meet the both of you, and this is such a wonderful documentary, especially for Beatles lovers. But let's hear it first is how did this project actually came about? What actually sparked this?
Well, Martin Scorsese and David Tedeschi and I have worked together for a long time, and we had the honor and the pleasure of working on a George Harrison documentary years ago called Living in the Material World. And we got to know Olivia Harrison and Danny and people in the Apple world very well because that project went on for several years. And so we had experience, we had that connection. And Apple several years ago started restoring the footage that the Albert and David Maysles shot in 1964 of the first US visit. And I think that restoration work went on for several years. So by the time it came to where it was coming to fruition, Olivia and everyone at Apple started thinking about who would be appropriate to take this story on and try to tell this story in a fresh way. And so David and Marty's names kind of came up, and everyone agreed as New Yorkers, as filmmakers who knew Albert Maysles very well. It just made sense for David and Marty to take it on.
Well said. David, could you tell us your approach on how you want to take this footage and retell a story?
Well, the challenge, of course, is that it's a very famous story and it's been told in different ways. So we did think about what could we do that was new. Um, and I think pretty quickly when we looked at the footage, we thought that the voices of these young fans, I had never really heard them the way I see them in the film. Um, they're excited. They've got a lot to say, and they're very in the moment. Like you have a real feeling of what it was like in 19. It's a real document of 1964, and that was part of what was so surprising. As you look at the footage, and it could be the 1950s, it could be the 1940s. The girls, for instance, in the hallway of the plaza, one of them has big hair, you know. And the Beatles themselves with the scandalously long hair, it's maybe not even as long as your hair. You can see their ears completely. It's for today's terms, it's not long hair. Um, so I think that was an initial impulse.
Absolutely. And not to mention with any Beatles documentary, you always have to try to get these new interviews. Tell us about bringing in Paul and Ringo for new interviews, and what was it easy to convince them to be part of this project?
Well, we were working, it's a co-production with Apple Corps, the Beatles company. So, I think it was always in our minds that Paul and Ringo would participate and be part of it. I think that the one of the stroke of luck that we came across was that Paul had simultaneously worked for years to put his photos from that trip together. I mean, he's an incredibly talented photographer. And so he was working on that project, and all of these memories were in his consciousness. He was kind of reliving that time. And so that really it was great that that coincided with our production. And so David and we could film Paul as his show at the Brooklyn Museum was about to open. So the timing for that was really fortuitous, and it was kind of a great way to kind of not just do a sit down interview with Paul, make it kind of spontaneous and dynamic.
And we felt the same way about Ringo in a way that although Ringo didn't have an exhibit, and this isn't really direct cinema, we wanted something that wasn't just a sit down interview.
Hmm.
You it was great, Ringo sitting behind the drums, playing the drums, that are the same drum kit as Ed Sullivan. And I think in a way, the physical memory of it brought back. I heard Ringo say things that I've never heard before that were pretty interesting. Like that he always wanted to be close to the band, and whenever anything goes wrong, everybody looks at the drummer.
I know those are wonderful interviews. And I do like how you actually somehow gathered up more interviews of fans of the past. How did you find these people and who what was the selection process on bringing them to this project?
I'll let Margaret talk about how we found these people, but I will say that Jack Douglas is a music producer we had worked with before. He had been the producer on the music for Personality Crisis, so another movie we worked on. And he had told me his whole story 2 months before Apple Corps reached out to me. So it was very present in my mind. Um, and we were looking for people like Jack, who the Beatles had a real impact on them. Beatles 64 had a real
Mhm.
impact on them, life-changing.
Mhm.
And that we're able to articulate in some way the experience. So a woman like Vicky Brenna Costa, who was a fan in front of the Plaza Hotel, um, it's beautiful what she says, that it's her spirit and then their spirit, and they come together for a moment. And I thought that was a beautiful way to describe what music does, which many people describe it in different ways. But I thought from her point of view, who, a teenager in 1964, I thought that was beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, the process was basically, extensive research on people who had taught, who had been quoted or had made contributions to different books about the Beatles, people that we've researched in interviews talking about, with the case of Danny Bennett, his collection of Beatles memorabilia, and people like Jamie Bernstein, who's a really, incredibly intelligent and gifted writer who also participates in weekly Beatles calls with other, incredible people who know, and love the Beatles so well and so much. And so I think, you could throw a stone and find 10 people who love the Beatles and can talk about why they're, great, and everyone is a fan of the Beatles, I would say almost universally. But what we were specifically looking for um, was that kind of profound reaction that turned their lives inside out, and is something that, transformed them and became something that was in their lives, even from if you were 13 years old and this happened to you, you're still thinking about the Beatles and you're still have that connection with their music, the way it evolved, and what the band kind of meant for a generation of people. And it still goes on, right? You saw um, uh, the last Beatles song was released, and teenagers on YouTube and on TikTok were sobbing, and so there's some un identified element about these four guys that just is captivating still.
And
Absolutely.
I think each person has something unusual or unique to say. I mean, I go back, for instance, to Sananda Maitreya. I love when he says, um, because I've seen many musicians talk about the moment they saw Sullivan and have they picked up a guitar the next week, and of course that's a common story. But I loved how Sananda, his first memory is hearing the Beatles on the radio, and I loved him saying, "I cursed those bitches because they were Pied Pipers who brought me into this new world of music."
Absolutely. I mean, this is a wonderful documentary, and the Beatles have inspired and touched the lives of so many people for generations. David, Margot, thank you for bringing to light Beatles 64. A lot of people will enjoy that, especially those people who love the Beatles. So, thank you very much for carrying this conversation with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gig. Appreciated it.